Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this. It is Dorothy, your host of the Death in Cambodia, Life in America podcast. I am back with another incredible guest for you guys. Today, we have Caylee So. She was born in a refugee camp in Thailand in 1981, just after her parents escaped the Cambodian genocide, or as people know as the Khmer Rouge. Shortly after high school, Caylee joined the Virginia Army National Guard, where she served 2 tours in Iraq. Thank you for your service. She also received her MFA in film directing from Chapman University. Caylee is the co-founder of none less than the infamous Cambodian Town Film Festival, and her award-winning feature film, In the Life of Music, was Cambodia's 2018 Oscars submission. She is one of the first Cambodian directors in Hollywood. I am so excited to have you on, Caylee. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. Jimriapsur, everyone out there listening.
Yes, Jombriapsua. So Caylee, I'm so excited to have you on. First of all, just thank you for coming and joining us. I wanted to start the conversation by taking it back to when you were born. You were considered what many people in our community call a 1.5er, right? So you were born in Khao Dang. Do you remember anything from growing up in the camps at all?
No. I was born in Kaladang in 1981, so I was there for about maybe two years before we made it to the Philippines, and then 4 years we made it to America. Very vague memories of Kaladang. In fact, I didn't even know I was born in a refugee camp until like later in life. I just thought I was born in Thailand. I thought Kaladang was like a city in Thailand. Not
Yeah.
until I did, later on as an adult did I realize that Kaladang was a refugee camp, because as a kid you don't have an understanding of what a refugee camp is.
No. What was that experience like? I mean, just learning the fact that you were born in a like refugee camp. I can imagine from my experience anyway, and from what I've read from some of your interviews, like your parents were not super open about their experiences during the Khmer Rouge. It's very common that not many of them are. So, what was that whole experience like, kind of learning about the fact that you were
Yeah,
born in a ref?
I think maybe like a lot of parents of that generation, or their generation, they survived the genocide and they came here, and when they talk about the war, they don't talk in full details about what the war is, right? They talk about it in passing. You understand this. I've heard conversations like that. And so my parents are like that too. They'll say things offhandedly. So I always thought, like, when my mom says stuff like "Chananapot," when your parent go "Chananapot," everyone was so hungry, So I always
Mm-hmm.
thought it was like an era, growing up. I was just like, oh yeah, their generation, they were hungry, like. But "Chananapot" means in the era of Pol Pot, which is in the genocide era, So whenever they would refer to the genocide, they would always say "Chananapot." So growing up, I always thought it was just an era in which, like a decade or something like that, they were speaking of. So to me, as a kid or growing up, I didn't take it for its full meaning or impact. When they said they were hungry, I'm like, oh yeah, we were poor, we were hungry. Now we're less poor and we're still a little hungry, but not as hungry as they were when they were in Jananapot, like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
how I interpret that conversation as I was growing up. And it wasn't until like much later in life did like that idea of being born in a refugee camp, of like what that struggle was like. Or I wrote a story of like my imagined birth, like in a very fictional way, with
Mm.
a lot of nonfiction in it. And my sister read it and she was just like, whoa, how did you know like this was what it felt like? I'm like, no, I just imagined what it would feel like to give birth inside a refugee camp, like as parents or as a mother. And this is after I've had my 2 kids, and I can't imagine like being pregnant during that time.
Yeah. Where did you grow up, Caylee? When you guys, after you guys, your mom had you in the camps, how long did she stay there before she came to America, and where did you guys grow up?
So my family had a choice between going to San Francisco, where my dad's cousin was, or to Virginia, where my mom's sister was, because they had arrived to America first. So in 1981, when we were given the choice of whether we were going to go to California or Virginia, they chose Virginia. Which is the irony is when I was growing up, I always wanted to be in California because, on TV, like everybody looked like they were having so much fun in California. So I always thought, when I grow older, maybe I'll live in California. Little did I know I actually did end up living in California.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, it wasn't a big Cambodian community. We were surrounded by a big enough Cambodian community because it almost seemed like everywhere you go, like someone would hear about like there's a cheap apartment complex in Virginia we call Colmore because the apartment was so cheap that like one Cambodian family would say, "Hey, move here." So one Cambodian family moved there, and then another, and then another, and so you would have like maybe like 20 or 30 Cambodian family like living in the same apartment complex. So I always felt like there was other Cambodian kids or uncles that weren't uncles, but we'd call uncles. So like growing up, I was always surrounded by that. That changed once like we started moving around Virginia, and then you started to feel like you're going to high school and the only other Cambodian in your high school is like your cousin.
Yeah.
So it becomes sparser and sparser as we grew up and like my family like moved away from that Colmore center and so did everybody else's family. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the reason why I retained my Khmer and I understand like a lot of Khmer is because my sister used to watch the Thai soap operas and the Chinese soap operas that were dubbed into Khmer. And because
Mm.
we only had one TV, like I couldn't watch my Friday afternoon cartoons. I had to watch like Chinese sagas and I
Hmm.
had to watch like Thai soap opera love stories. And so I grew up on that. And that's how I retained my Khmer. And I'm thankful for my sister for making me go through that because now I know the language. When it was happening, I was just like, can I just watch my cartoons? And why do I have to watch all this love story?
I can totally relate, but on the opposite side now because I actually don't understand or speak a whole lot of Khmer. And I wish I did. I wish I had something uh or someone besides my parents, but my parents started speaking English quite early on with me, only because they were so involved in American business quite early on. So because of that, I think I ended up growing up just like hearing it and semi-understanding it, but I don't feel confident enough to speak it besides, Jumbipsua and Akun and stuff like that. But, growing up in Virginia, I can imagine without having that strong Khmer community around you, along with every other Cambodian American out there, I would imagine. There's always like a point in your life, especially I feel like around the teenage years, where you kind of struggle between your Cambodian identity and your American identity. And I want to learn a little bit more about what your relationship is like with being Cambodian back then when you were growing up.
Mm. Um, my teenage years, I, I honestly don't remember ever thinking like I had any conflict between being Cambodian or American, but I did feel like I didn't embrace like my culture as much as I do now. And the
Mm.
reason why I say that is because I didn't have any Cambodian friends at that time, and I remember. I think it was middle school. This kid, for some odd reason, I think because I was the only other Asian person in the classroom, and it was like home economics or something like that. And he was like, Shamrong, I'm reading this book, and do you know if Cambodia is a real country? And I looked at him and I was just like, yeah, it's absolutely a real country. My parents are from Cambodia. And the book he was reading was Children of the River by
Mm.
Linda Crew. And it was the first time, someone had ever asked me if Cambodia was a real country.
Yeah.
And at that moment, one of the things I felt was like, man, I wish I knew I wish I was like Chinese or something, like that's like the Asia country like everyone knew, and
Everyone accepts and,
yeah, and
yeah.
it was the language that like, the business language. Everybody was like, oh, if you speak Chinese, it's an additional to your credit or whatnot. But if you speak Khmer, like, is Cambodian a real country,
Mhm.
So that was what I was thinking, like, when I was in middle school and high school. And I was just surrounded by friends that were not Cambodian. Everyone was Laos, Filipino, Korean,
Right.
other ethnicities and things like that. So there wasn't a moment where I was just like proud of like, my heritage or my culture.
Mhm.
That didn't come until like a lot later in life. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I have read in a one of your interviews is for Christine Sue's book,
mm,
um, that when your late mother passed in college, from what I read, that was a really, really impactful moment in your life and an impactful period in your life that redirected maybe some of that fire for learning about your culture and learning about being Khmer. Can you talk a little bit, if you're comfortable, can you talk a little bit just about how that experience changed you?
yeah. We talked about how when I was younger, like there wasn't this need to like ask a lot of questions, right? You don't
Right.
you don't go digging, you don't go asking a lot your parents about memories or where they came from. I don't know what it is about like kids,
Yeah.
parents they just exist.
Right.
So when my mom passed away and it was very sudden, I think I was like a freshman in college. And she had a brain aneurysm and ended up in the hospital. And within like a day, like we had to um choose to either let her go or, have her stay on the ventilator. And I remember making that choice and it
Wow.
was a very hard choice, but we made it. Because we always knew that she was a fighter and she wouldn't want to live in that way. But after I lost her, I just thought about like, wow, like I don't I don't really know that much about my mom. Like aside from her being my mom, like, where was she born?
Yeah.
Where did she grow up? What did she love? What did she miss? All these things. And I felt like you just almost feel like there's like a missing hole in your history that you
Yeah.
never really got to explore. So
You
in that
almost feel like
moment,
you,
I went and I tried to like look for maybe writings or old photos, and we realized we didn't have much because the genocide, and my mom didn't really write a journal, so there was no thoughts, afterthoughts, or anything like that. No videos. And so for me, that was like a moment of like I have to do the work, I have to kind of like write the stories, or I have to come up with the idea of who she was or what she wanted or things like that. And so that's when I started like learning about Cambodian history, the war, the genocide, just a really deep dive, not surface level, oh, we survived the war, things like that. So this was on a different level of like digging. Like I really wanted to know it all.
right.
So then that kind of began my journey into like being a little bit more prideful of my heritage and what my parents had survived.
Mm. Are you Chinese Cambodian? Do you know Kaylee?
Yeah, we are I, more than a quarter Chinese, less than 10% Vietnamese, and the rest Cambodian. So like this is like
It's
yeah.
okay. It's very common to be a mix of,
Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. But I always knew I was like a lot, there was a lot of Chinese blood, a lot of
Yeah.
Chinese heritage in me. But like I didn't know the 10% Vietnamese part until like maybe 5 years ago or something like that. We had a conversation about it, and they're like, "Oh yeah, one of our grandparents, was also Vietnamese." And I'm like, "Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah." My dad speaks fluent Vietnamese growing up, and I always wanted to learn to speak Vietnamese because I had so many like Vietnamese friends, and my first boyfriend was Vietnamese, and I'm like, I can't speak Vietnamese. Why can't I speak Vietnamese? And he also speaks Chinese, a little bit of Chinese. He said he doesn't speak it that well, but he does speak it. And then he spoke a little French, and then English. But he
Yeah.
didn't want to teach any of his kids that because he didn't want to confuse us. He said, and I'm just like, oh well.
Yeah.
But now I understand, having kids of my own, how hard it is to teach a kid two different languages when out in the world you're only speaking one language.
Right. Yeah, the reason why I ask that is because I wonder if that kind of stark moment in your life made you claim your Khmer-ness more and claim your Cambodian identity a little bit more than before the event. I know that, or had you always kind of accepted and felt Khmer, like that never really was an issue for you.
No, I think absolutely my mom's death and taking a deep dive into Cambodian history made me feel more Cambodian because now I understood like where I came from, and that relation to the country felt like like to me she was Cambodia, so in a way
Yeah.
I prized it more after.
Right, right. It made you feel closer to
Mm,
her every
yeah.
time you studied and learned and listened to the music. I know that after a certain while, I think this was probably around the same time potentially that you had enlisted and joined the army, or it was before, right? Before this that you joined the army?
Yeah. I, I, j- um, I joined the Army National Guard when I was 18.
Mm.
I think it was it was a decision I made all by myself. And I remember when I made the decision, I was like, okay, I'm not going to tell my parents. I'm not going to tell my brothers. I'm not going to tell my sisters. I'm going to go see this recruiter. I'm going to take all my tests. I'm going to, do all my physical and everything like that. So I went out there and I did all these things and I signed the dotted line, as they called it. And after I signed the dotted line, I came home and my mom and dad was there and I was in the dining room and I looked over at them. I'm like, Ma, Pa, I have to tell you something. And they're like, what? And I said, just to let you guys know, I just joined the army. And their faces were just like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, I decided I wanted to join the army. It's only part-time, it's not like the full army. It's an Army National Guard. It's 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. I get to serve my country. I get to go to college and all these things. And then my mom just looked at me and she was so sad. She was like, oh, I could have taken another job and pay for your college, something like that.
Yeah.
So now I think about that moment, and it was really about like this 18-year-old who didn't understand that their parents had just survived the war and a genocide, and you had just come home and you're like, I joined the army.
It's like
So
you never.
now in retrospect, like 10, 15 years later, I look back at that moment and like the faces feel different to me or they seem different. Now I understand it more, like
Hmm.
having knowledge of the history, having knowledge of what it is to be a parent and things like that. So now I know what those facial expressions are. But as an 18-year-old, you thought they're just, a little upset because I didn't tell them. Or I went and did this thing and I came home and I was just like, Mom, Dad, I joined the army. And everyone and my brothers and sisters were just like, yeah, Caylee doing Caylee things, because I was always the kid who like I always felt like it was easier to ask for forgiveness than permission because if I had to ask for permission, I would be talked out of things and I didn't want that.
What was your motivation, do you think, behind signing up for the army? I think it takes a certain kind of personality to do that. I mean, not everybody would want to go into that and take that
Mm.
path. What was the motivation kind of behind that?
I think for one, okay, number one, I always felt like I wanted to make my own way in the world. As at that time, I think I was like a commuter college student, so I was still at home. But two, it was a way to pay for college. But also, I wouldn't have to leave my parents, like I would have never done like army full time because I couldn't imagine leaving my parents to take care of the house bills and stuff like that on their own. So I wanted to contribute to the family. I'm like, hey, I'm going to make some money. I'm going to help pay for the electricity bill, the house bills, things like that. And then I'll be able to go to college. I wanted to buy a car. I wanted to do things, as an 18-year-old that you couldn't necessarily do on your own or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I remember growing up, I used to like love playing with like, I don't know, this is something you should know. But when other kids were playing with Barbies, I was playing with like toy swords and guns and things because I was watching Chinese movies. So and I respected the police officers that were in my community and things like that. So someone pitching to an 18-year-old how you could serve your country, part-time, 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year felt like something I was able to do.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think so you served in two tours in Iraq, is that
Mhm.
correct? How has that shaped you in that period in your life? How has that shaped who you are today? In what ways did that time impact you?
I think you view the world differently. I think after an experience like that, when you're kind of deployed in Iraq, the way the world sees you in uniform or as an American shifts. Um, I think I remember thinking at that time if it was right for us to be in that country. And then I knew it was like a bigger decision than like a 20-year-old, had the right to think of like, I couldn't fathom it. But when we were on the road, I just looked at the way everybody else was looking at it, Americans in uniform. You had Korean soldiers who were looking at me like, oh my gosh, it's this female in uniform. Like that was
Yeah.
an oddity, right? So to me, that was the thing when I came back. I was like, okay, like it's much different to be in America in uniform, but to be outside of America in uniform is a completely different ordeal altogether. And just the way I see war is different.
Mm-hmm.
And these wars are still happening. There's always this conversation about whether America should be in this country, shouldn't be in this country, when we're not in this country. Like we should be in this country to peacekeep and things like that. And it becomes such a blur because at one point you want to be proud that you're in uniform, and at some other points you're conflicted about America's role in certain wars, right?
Yeah.
So that was always like a conversation you have with yourself.
Yeah. Did you ever have a kind of conflict with internal conflict maybe about the fact that you were in uniform and how that may have paralleled with the fact that your parents had survived the Khmer Rouge and that war? Did that ever cross your mind at that time, or was it really just like you signed up and you're in the
Your mic is
situation?
going on. Your mic is going, having some interference. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Did you did you ever have internal conflict during that period as you were wearing the uniform and also understanding that your parents had survived the genocide and the war during that time? Like, was that ever kind of in your mind, or was it more so you signed up, you were 18, you signed up, you thought it was a good opportunity, and here you are, you know? Do you ever have that internal struggle?
No, you know what it is. I viewed it as uh, a responsibility. Like I signed the dotted line. This is my job. When the country calls, you don't make those decisions. You signed up to serve, right?
Right, right,
So for me, if I didn't go, someone else would have to go in my place, right?
right,
So I was never conflicted about whether I I was gonna go, wanted to go. That is just something like I took as a responsibility. I'm a person in uniform. The country
right,
called. I'm answering, right?
right.
The only thing that I thought about was maybe because my mom left so suddenly, and I wish I had like a letter or something from her. I remember before each deployment, I would write a letter to my family.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd stick it in my desk drawer. and then I would go off. That way, like, there would be last words. I don't think my family even knew I did this, and I don't even know where I put those letters after I came back. But I did that before every deployment, and then I put it out of my head because when you're off to war like that, you can't think you're not you're not coming back or you're gonna get shot.
Sure.
I mean, I feel very, very lucky, because so many times over there where things would happen and I'd be like, oh wow, like I just barely, I'm
My
lucky to
life
be
just got
alive.
yeah.
I'm like, wow, my mom's taking care of me, like things like that. So,
Right.
and then you come home and you think you're gonna integrate into civilian life, and then you get deployed again.
Yeah. I know in a past experience, in a past interview, that you had mentioned there was one night where you and your comrades were kind of sitting down to watch a movie. I think it was Million Dollar Baby.
Mm.
Um, and you, just for a moment, in the midst of all the chaos, you and your comrades were able to find a little bit of peace through watching a movie that kind of transported you out of your current situation. And you felt, correct me if I'm wrong, that that was a really, really powerful thing that a movie can do. And so, I'm thinking about all the experiences that you've had being in the army, losing your mom, unfortunately, so early on, that kind of reignited your Khmer identity, and then having experiences where you sort of felt like maybe storytelling or movie making would be something that could contribute good in the world. And so I'm thinking about your journey to becoming what you are today as a director. And I wanted to know, was that moment the moment you knew you wanted to be a director? Or how was that journey from army to director? Because that is quite a jump.
You know, I've always liked theater, and I've always liked actors, because you watch television, you're like, oh, what is the actors. You don't really, as a kid, you don't think about like the directors or the people holding a camera, all those things, right?
Sure.
So in elementary school, and we put on a play called Deadly as an Icarus, and I remember being cast as the narrator in that. And I remember, the first moments before getting on stage, I like had like butterflies in my stomach. But when I got on stage, something very powerful about narrating a story. And that was when I started to kind of like acting, right?
Hmm.
The actor. And then for a while, I took lots of theater classes through middle school and through high school. But I absolutely, I mean, I loved actors, or like, I loved the idea of acting, but I hated being on stage. And I never knew, I never thought about anything other than that, right? Like, you're not thinking about like the directors and whatnot. Um, so years later, when I was deployed in Iraq, we were on a mission from Iraq to Kuwait. And I remember there was a movie that I really wanted to watch with Hilary Swank in it, and it was directed by Clint Eastwood. And I found a DVD at a bootleg stand. And instantly I was like, I gotta watch this movie. The movie was a new release. So I bought the DVD, and then I went to the MWR Center, and I waited in line to put this DVD in so that I could watch it. And I remember like when I was watching it, I was like the only female soldier in the room, and everyone else was like a male soldier. And towards the end of the movie, I wanted to just like bawl. But
Hmm.
I just looked around and I was just like, you cannot be bawling in front of everybody like this. So I looked up like this. I sat there and I was just like this, and like trying so hard to be like all like and like like
Macho and
meanwhile I'm like, oh, I gotta go cry outside. So then when the movie ended, I did go outside because I was just so emotional about like this character's journey, right? And for those 2 hours, you forget that you're in uniform, you forget that you're in war and whatnot. And it wasn't until the end that I like was outside, and I was just like, wow, that's a crazy experience, to just forget. And I think that was the moment where I um, thought about like who gets to do that. And then I researched, and I was just like, oh, a director is the pilot, the creative pilot of the ship. At least that's what I read. And so I thought maybe instead of like acting or theater, I wanted to actually direct. That way I could be the storyteller, the person who comes up with these stories. Yeah, and that was when the seed was planted about being a director. And I remember when I came home from that deployment, I changed my major from business to creative writing because I knew creative writing meant that I could find a way to tell a story. And then later on, I could shift to like filmmaking and directing, because the college that I went to at the time, George Mason University, didn't have a film program, but they did have like a communications where you can pick up this small camera and do these little videos. So I knew I kind of like had to learn how to storytell before I can be a director.
Yeah. And what was your journey after that? So you decided you changed your major.
Hmm.
You decided the seed was planted. You're like, okay, I want to be able to tell stories. What was the journey after that? I know that at this point, you are one of the, forefront headers when it comes to highlighting Cambodian stories. Um, but what was your path to get where you are today?
Well, so after that, I started to like write. I think I applied for an internship after I would graduate from my bachelor's degree in creative writing. I thought I would take an internship and learn how to make movies by making movies, by doing work. So I
Mm-hmm.
remember applying for internships at, I don't remember if it was the Jimmy Kimmel or one of the late night shows, and I believe I was about to graduate that summer. I had just had my 10-minute play, which was gonna be produced on stage that summer, that fall as or spring as well. And then I was gonna move to California, take this internship, and just learn how to be a director, like boots on the ground, with my creative writing degree. And I had all planned because that same spring, like I would turn in all my army uniform. I turned in my army uniform, my everything, my jackets, and I remember I'm like, wow, I can't believe this, chapter of my life is over. Now I get to go into the next chapter of my life, which is I'm gonna go be a filmmaker. And then the day that my play, which was called Talking War, ironically, was in production, and I was at the store and I get a phone call, and I look at my phone, and it's like my first sergeant or something like that. And I just remember I'm like, fuck, like there's just this like, there's this alarm in your head when like you don't get this phone call often, and when it does, you're like,
This is not a good thing. It's like, I thought I left this behind. What's
yeah,
up?
and I picked up the phone, and there was my sergeant telling me that I had to go to my weekend SRP. And SRP is a soldier readiness program, right? So right away I'm like, ah, I'm getting deployed. So then I go back to the theater, and my show, The Talking War, was gonna be acted on stage. And I remember watching that, and I was just like, oh, here we go again, chapter 2 of this. And then I did go to the weekend drill. I did find out that, I was stop loss. Stop loss is when the military is allowed to push a pause button on your contract. Because I had like, I think 2 weeks left in my contract. So, so I was stop loss and I would be deployed again. And in fact, this next deployment, it wasn't even with my old unit because I had already left my old unit. My old unit, I would have been deployed. It would have been like, on the first deployment, there was like 40 females, 30 to 40 females, and like 100 guys, 100 males. With this second deployment, it's a whole new unit. I didn't really know. I was going to be attached to an infantry unit because at that time, females weren't allowed to be in an infantry unit. So I was going with the mechanic unit, and there was 3 females and 160 guys. And I was just like, "Oh, wow. This is a new space." Yeah. So then I did my second tour in Iraq. And in my second tour in Iraq, is when I actually the military has this thing where the battalion does morale plays to boost morales for soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
So they would come up with these morale plays competition. And that was kind of when I directed my first stage production using other actors who were soldiers.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, so that was the most interesting thing because at that time, I remember it was Black History Month, and one of my sergeants was just like, we did the first play and it went so badly. We heard so that you are an English major. And I said, yes, yes, I am. And he was just like, would you like to write this next play for us? And I'm just like, what do you mean? And he was like, yeah, it's a morale play, it's just to boost the morale. The battalion has a play competition. If you win some medals and possibly like a $20 gift card to the PX, which is the army equivalent of like a Walmart. And I was just and at that time I was like working in the office and things like that. So I was just like, okay, yeah, I'll take it on. And I remember writing this really, really interesting play, and it was like using three actors, and they were at an insane asylum or something like that. And they all thought they were like, I can't even remember who the person was anymore. Carver, I believe. And they were
Mm-hmm.
talking to the psychiatrist. And I just remember the play was so interesting. And afterwards, everybody just like, they were like, that was so good. They're like, we have to do something for Women's History Month. I'm like, I thought it was a one and done. So then my first sergeant and my captain came up to me afterwards, and they were so proud that like everybody really loved like our 10-minute play. They were just like, okay, the next one, anything you need, you got it. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, so the next one was Women's History Month. And in that particular play, like everybody wanted to be a part of it. They're like, okay, what do you need? So I made it instead of three people, I made it, it was like a 30-person production. Like there were people that were spying on other units to see what kind of plays they were producing. I mean, like everyone was just coming with A games. There were like people who had like voices of like Luther Vandross singing songs and stuff, opening up this 10-minute play. And I was just like, wow, this thing is really competitive. And for that, experience to be the first time I've ever directed anything in my life was kind of crazy to think about now. But I remember it was just this experience of being in wartime, and trying to get my friends to all act, and then to
Yeah.
have their understudy be, because like if they were on a mission, someone else would have to do it the day the play was going to happen, and I would be everybody else's understudy. It was a kind of a strange, strange atmosphere to be in wartime and then to put on this like play, as it.
Yeah. I find it fascinating that like there's just so many there's so many contrasts. And when you look back at your life and you think about like how you have this creative side, but you always had the tours that you went on, and every tour seemed to deepen your love for the arts and for the creatives, even though those two things are almost completely opposite of each other when you think of like when you just think of them as is. And so I think it's incredible that you have such a passion for the creatives and for the arts. I feel like that's why you've become so successful. And it's really cool to watch how your experience in the army has really kind of fueled that. You, at this point, I feel like really, really love to highlight Cambodian stories and Cambodian culture when we think about, the life of music that you had created, the Cambodian Film Festival that you had, co-founded, if I'm right, you co-founded that. At what point did you think to yourself, okay, now I've written so many things, but I feel like the path that I should be taking is to highlight Cambodian stories. Was there a shift? Was there a moment that made you realize that? Or where did that really kind of stem from?
So I think I stayed away from telling the Cambodian story for a very long time. It wasn't until my thesis year, my third year at Chapman, the final year, did I sit down. And it was accidental, in fact, because I had a sci-fi idea. And up until that point, I was directing all these dramas. I directed a drama that was in Spanish called Testigo Ilegal, which was written by someone else. And then everything before that was also just not Cambodian at all. In fact, I hadn't even stepped into the Cambodian community yet because Chapman University in Orange County felt like an island all its own. And I just immersed myself in kind of studying films, and just making all these other stories. And my thesis idea was like some short sci-fi drama. But I hadn't flushed out the idea yet. So I was just like, okay. And I had to go into class and pitch an idea. And so I knew I couldn't pitch that idea because that idea wasn't even a log line yet. But I knew I had another idea, and this idea was something that I've had for a very long time, even when I was in Iraq, in fact, because it was part of the short story that I had written as my submission, and it was called like Diary of a Gambler. And I remember that, when I was in Iraq, I was like, I'm gonna go get my MFA in filmmaking, and I need to write a short screenplay to submit as my application. And my application was Diary of a Gambler. And that was from a point of view of a, young Cambodian girl. So I remember walking into class that morning, and I said, my story is about a 17-year-old girl who lives inside a Cambodian gambling community, who struggles with gambling addiction and her father's gambling addiction. And my professor at that time just looked up at me, and he was just like, what does a Cambodian gambling community look like? He was so intrigued. And he said, yeah, I'm interested. Like, go write that. And I looked around and I was like, I now have to go write this thing, Mhm. So then I went and I wrote the treatment for it. And the treatment is like a 1-2 pager. And it came so easy and so fast. It's probably still the fastest thing I've ever written in my life. And so the next week I turned in this treatment. And again, the professor's like, this is amazing, Caylee. Like, go write this script. And I was just like, oh my goodness, now I'm committed to writing this script. And then I go home and I sit down and I write this 12-page script. And it's like the easiest 12-page script I have ever written in my life. And I turn it in and I come in and my professor was like, this is what a short screenplay should feel and be like. And he loved the script so much. And he looked up at me and he said, Caylee, I see that there's a lot of Cambodians that you need for this movie. Do you think you can find this many actors? And I looked at him and I said, there's about 150,000 Cambodians in the Long Beach community. I'm sure I can convince 100 of them to be in my movie. I said, no problem. Like it was like a fake it till you make it kind of ordeal. And so this is what I told him. And he goes, good. I'm greenlighting the script. Go make your thesis movie. And I said, and then when I walked out of the room, I'm like, holy shit, I have to go make this movie. How am I going to get 100 Cambodians?
Yeah.
And not only 100 Cambodians, but they were like all, there were at least 6 or 7 main actors in it. That was when I joined and went to and met and did all of these Cambodian things. Like, I crashed so many student clubs that weren't even Dodge College. I mean, I went to Irvine. I joined a Khmer club, Cambodian Student Society club that wasn't even in my school. And I was like the oldest person in there. They were like doing icebreakers. I'm like near 30s and I'm just like, here we go. But it was such an interesting experience because, the Cambodian Student Society, they just loved the culture so much. And that in turn made me really, really excited about making this thesis. But at the same time, everywhere I went, I had to pitch this idea of like a Cambodian community of like gambling addicts. So
Yeah.
not only it felt like everybody was excited that, there was going to be a Cambodian-American film, but then they're like, but does it have to be something negative, like as gambling? So you kind of saw both sides of it, like the hesitation to putting something that could be bad out there, but then the excitement of having a Cambodian American voice. At that time, there wasn't another Cambodian American director that you can kind of, hey, how are you working your way around this, or
Yeah.
how are you dealing with this, or like, could you put in a good word for me, because at that time, like, I was just this new kid on the block, the Cambodian
Right.
block, and nobody had trusted me yet. Like now I could go around and say I'll make this, and I'd get so much support because people understand, or people would understand that whatever I was doing was contributing to the story of the Cambodian diaspora. And whether it was in a good or bad light, like I would take care of it,
Yeah.
But
How
at
did
that
that
time,
make
I was
you?
just a new kid.
How does that make you feel when you write it, when you highlight Cambodian stories? And was it after that moment that you realized, okay, moving forward, I think this is what I really want to focus on? Like, what's the importance of highlighting Cambodian stories to you?
Someone asked me if I was going to keep making Cambodian stories or if I was going to make something more mainstream. I think this was after I made Pauline, and I just told them, I would just make any. If there were more Cambodian American stories or Cambodian stories that inspired me to make Cambodian stories, then I will continue to do it. And it's such a untapped uh, kind of field because there's not until this day, there's still not a Cambodian American feature film. I mean, I think In the Life of Music had one Cambodian American in it, but everything was shot in Cambodia. It was a Cambodian submission, like, most of the language was Cambodian. So that atmosphere, like, there's still so many stories left to tell.
Yeah.
And then
What
I
was
I
the
always get the question about, like, why are there still so many people telling the stories of the genocide? And there is, I guess, a section of Cambodians or folks that believe that we should move beyond the Cambodian genocide stories. But I always think about, like, how there's maybe 3 million Cambodian genocide stories, and we're putting out like maybe one a year, So that means there's at least 2.999 million people whose stories are still out there who probably wants to be told. So as long as there's a good story to tell, regardless of whether it's a Cambodian American story, a Cambodian story, a genocide story, I think if it inspires you to make it, you make it. You don't choose whether it's going to be mainstream. I choose the story by what inspires me.
and what was the inspiration behind Life of Music when you created that?
In the Life of Music, I had watched the documentary Don't Think I've Forgotten, Cambodia's Lost Rock and Roll at the Cambodian Town Film Festival that fall, I believe. And then that winter, I went to Cambodia with a friend. And I remember meeting up with a lot of filmmakers and having like all these conversations about storytelling. There was this young filmmaker, and he was telling me about how much it would cost to make a short film in Cambodia. And it was something around like, he's like, yeah, for $5,000, you can make a short film, right? And I was just like, wow, like in America, you're spending like $50,000 on a short film. Like, that's
Right.
crazy. And then I just remember talking to him about Cambodia's lost rock and roll. And, and he had like, he wanted to do a Sinsi Samut story. And then on the plane ride home, I thought, oh, you know what? What if we like made 3 short films as an anthology, as if like if these walls could talk. I don't know if you've seen that film, but it's a story about how a collection of women who lives in this one house and through generations, right? Tied together by the fact that they live in this one house. So I thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting if we told the story in 3 different decades of Cambodia, and we used a song to tell the story of these people's lives. So when I came home, I pitched that idea to my producer, and she really loved it. And she was like, yeah, let's write a treatment. So the idea was to get 3 different directors, 3 different decades, 3 different stories tied together by a song. That was kind of like the genesis of the idea. And then as we were in production for it and things like that, it evolved, right? It became a story about one family, 3 different decades and things like that. And that happened like over time, like during pre-production, production. And even while we were shooting the film, I remember during the break from shooting, it might have been The Song of Love. I think we shot that one first. So that section in 1968 was called The Song of Love. And we shot that one first. And I remember watching and I'm like, I have to go revise The Song of Death, which is the second decade, which is the genocide decade. So in that 2 weeks that we took a break to build this village, right? I was in my hotel room. I was like making all these like script changes, like based on like what I had seen um, in the Song of Love, and I remember going into there, and it was such an interesting way of filmmaking because I had never changed the script while we were making the film before. But it happened because I had loved this idea of staying with one of the mother a little bit longer, and so that happened. And then we shot the Song of Birth. Did we shoot the Song of Birth last? Yeah, it was quite a journey. So that was how it happened, and by the time it was in production, things like that $5,000 per short film was not not at all what we paid, what took to make the movie. To the credit of my producer Nirdai, while I was in Cambodia, and we were spending the money, we were in production, we were getting like camera sponsors and things like that. She was like looking for money to fund the rest of the film because we were already there, like kind of like in the midst of making the film. So not only was the script changing, but also the amount of money it would take to make the film also changed, because at that time even the script itself was kind of like growing and growing and growing. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it
So
was it was definitely an adventure to make that film.
when you think about your success in being one of the first and probably only still Cambodian American directors, and if I'm missing anybody, I'm correct me if I'm wrong again, but when you think about your success, why do you think it's because you just happen to be there at the right place at the right time in terms of going into this field, and that there were not that many people who were Cambodian at that time going into directing? Or do you think it's also something to do with the types of stories that you're drawn to, and um the types of stories that you like to create? What do you think, or maybe both, what do you think has been the biggest contributor to your success to this day?
I mean, I think it takes a little bit of everything. I mean, we always say um, it's a miracle to get a film made, like a feature film. Like it's just
Right.
when you get it done, it just feels like a miracle because it takes so much uh, collaboration. It takes so much luck, right place, right time,
Right.
right financier, right whatever it is. It just takes a lot. So I don't know if it's like one thing in particular. I think that was helpful that I just literally jumped off a cliff and was just like, I'm just going to be a filmmaker. I'm not going to take a job. I'm going to live and eat and breathe and make film for the next 3 years, because I had walked into that classroom for the very first day and I knew that I had the least amount of film experience, but the most amount of like life experience. Because I remember when I was my first day at Chapman University, like everybody was younger than me. Everybody had editing experience or some kind of filmmaking experience, and I felt like I was the only one who was in that room who was like, oh shoot, I've never really like edited a film. But that was why I chose Chapman University, because they had touted their application asked for people with life experience, and I knew that I at that time felt I had lived so much in the 28 years that I was alive. So I knew I had that to offer. And then it was just about finding my voice. And I think when I made Paulina, my thesis film, that I felt like was the moment where like everybody understood what my filmmaking voice was. Even I now understood, right? It was a film that was very Cambodian-American. Um, and it was a film that was also universal.
Mm-hmm.
Gambling addiction doesn't just happen in the Cambodian community. I was just very specific because I knew what that world looked like, and I knew I could paint that world for people, and that the Cambodian community would see it and know it. and then the rest of the world would just be invited into this world with us.
Mm-hmm.
So in that respect, like Paulina was my like launch into like the Cambodian American like storytelling verse. And I still think there's a lot of stories left to be told, you know? And so we're constantly thinking about like, you know, what is the next story?
Was that a big reason why you co-founded the Cambodian Film Festival? You felt like it was extremely important to highlight other filmmakers and other people who were trying to elevate Cambodian stories?
I think that was a Pratchett's brainchild. I think that he grew up in Long Beach. I did not. So he had always craved like a place or a platform for just a Cambodian story to be seen on the big screen. And I don't know if you know Pratch, but he's a Cambodian American rap artist, or he's touted as the, you know, one of the first rap artists. And we became friends during Paulina. I used his music in the film itself. And I remember after graduation, he had pitched to me the idea of being on the selection committee of the Cambodian Town Film Festival. Now, the
Mm.
Cambodian Town Film Festival was just an idea at this time, but he was adamant that, like, you know, he wanted to make it happen. And I just wanted to watch more Cambodian stories. And I was just like, oh, that's exciting. You know, I could just watch Cambodian films and just decide which one gets shown on the big screen. Like, that seems like a very good job, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But as the planning for the film festival happens, I'm a very like logistical person. And I remember thinking like, you know, what are the steps that you need to do to make this Cambodian Film Festival happen? I think he had like the idea and he had the support of the community and things like that. And I looked up to see what it would take to make a film festival. Then like the pieces started to fall together. I was like, look, we got to find the films, we got to make the website, we got to do the applications, we got to, you know, we got to get it out there if this thing is going to happen. So then it just became like a two-man job. I accidentally inserted myself into being a co-founder without realizing it, because in my brain, I'm like, oh, how does it, you know, in the same way, like, how do you get a film started? I was like, how do you get a film festival started? I looked up Sundance and I look up all these applications. I'm like, these are the questions you should ask. This is what we're, you know, like what films are out there? Like, what does it look like? And we weren't even thinking about the audience per se yet. We were like, you know, if we build it, they will come kind of ordeal. And they
Mm-hmm.
really did. Like that first year, like, you know, we went around, we told everybody about the Cambodian Town Film Festival. And on the morning of the first screening, there was like a long line wrapped around the art theater. And we were just like, wow, they did come. You know, like, that's amazing.
We've been craving it. We've been
Yeah.
craving it. Yes.
Yeah.
Think I think it's so refreshing to and exciting also to know that there is a creative like you out there who is championing Cambodian-American stories and experiences. As you said, it's just there are so many more stories out there, and I am with you in terms of like, some people can argue and say like, "Oh, why are you focusing so much on the bad and the Khmer Rouge," as you mentioned earlier, but I think I'm with you in that there's just it's like we don't have that enough content for me to feel satisfied yet though. You know what I mean? Like there's so many more stories out there that are just kind of being left and quite honestly in my opinion ignored. Our history alone, Cambodian history is just barely starting to be taught in education systems. We don't have, when you compare the amount of books and the amount of movies we have compared to other maybe disastrous things that have happened in history, I just don't think that it does it justice, Like, I feel like we just deserve more. Our experience is so different. Being a child of refugees is different. Being born in a refugee camp is different from so many other storylines that you hear out there. When you think about your next projects and your upcoming projects, Caylee, what do you look for when it comes to stories, and what is the value, and what is the most important thing you look for when it comes to diving into a new project?
For me, it always starts with character. I think about like making a movie is being in a marriage, right?
Mm.
So you're going to be in this marriage for a very long time. So you have to love the people in your stories. But also like I said earlier, um I don't necessarily I want to feel genreless
Mm.
like I'm a big fan of rom-coms, you know. I want to be able
Same.
to direct a rom-com one day. Still, you know, have these sci-fi ideas. We're currently in development on a historical horror film, and that is the next movie that we want to produce and make, and I'm very excited about telling it. And when that is greenlit, we'll come back and we'll have a conversation about that. But yeah, we have a lot of things in the works. I know I'm also producing a sports drama with my producer, so we'll see. We'll see what the next one is. But I think it's genreless. I think it's just like what characters inspire you, what story inspires you, and you just make it. I don't think you think about how niche the audience will be.
Mm.
Because that sometimes gets asked, like who, you know, who's going to I want to say when I was making Paulina, they're like, who is this film made for? I'm like, it's made for everyone. I feel like everyone can universally understand um this relationship with the struggle and relationship with a parent, you know, and
Mhm.
gambling and addiction in the life of music. Like everybody can understand that there's a song in your life that takes you back to a time, right? Like a song for me has a life of its own.
Mhm.
And I remember when we picked him, like as soon as I pitched the idea, like the Champa Batambong, at that time, like we hadn't heard it a lot yet. Now it's everywhere. But at that time, like I knew that that was the song because that was the song of my childhood, right? Like I didn't know very many Cambodian songs, but that song I knew. So that, I mean, you can be inspired by anything, really, but
Mhm.
as long as it speaks to your heart and your creative voice and things like that, you know, I say pursue it.
Mhm. Well, Kaylee, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your knowledge, sharing your story, sharing your journey. It's you have so many. I think what makes you unique is that you have so many different facets of life experience that I feel like you did not take the normal, quote unquote, normal path to becoming a director. And in every point in your life, you had always been diving head on into something that you had no experience in previously, and yet you just kind of tackled it head on. And I think we need people like that, especially in our Cambodian-American community, somebody who, as I said, championing our stories, or at least just being a representative, to be honest, because there's just not that many Cambodian directors out there.
You just recently interviewed another Cambodian American director, didn't you?
Buntun, yes, yes, he
Yeah,
is also, and I've said the same thing. I told him too in the interview, and I was like, we need like 10 more of you guys out there.
absolutely.
Like we're counting up slowly.
And the amazing thing about the last film festival is we had an entire section of short films made by Cambodian American directors. And that is
Mhm.
something that I would not have thought about happening 10 years ago. Like there's so many more now and I'm
Yeah.
grateful and, you know, happy to be in this moment with them.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely a renaissance, as I would say, that is kind of happening within our community. But Kayla, you have been in it for longer than I feel like most people who are now coming in. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing your life experience and your work. I'm sure that all these up and coming directors are looking at you as definitely their inspiration. And if people wanted to find you and your work, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram. I think it's at Caylee So.
Mhm.
And at Cambodia Town Film Festival, you can always follow Cambodia Town Film Festival if you want to know what stories, movies, or things are out there that are Cambodian American, Cambodian content. Yeah. And also, we have I think in the next, I want to say May or June, my film, The Harvest, is going to be my feature film, my second feature film, The Harvest, is going to be released. So look out for that. That one is produced by Dua Mua, who also stars in it, and it's a Hmong American family drama, which is kind of another world that I knew nothing about and kind of dived into as we were making the film.
I'm sure our listeners can't wait for that release, Kaylee. But again, I appreciate you coming on here. Do you have any last words for any future up and coming film directors who may be listening?
Yeah, stay inspired. Find the stories that make you feel excited about being a filmmaker because those are the stories that will stay with you. And welcome. The struggle
Well,
is
you
long and
heard it
hard,
from
but worth
Kaylee.
it.
You heard it from Kaylee herself, guys. Thank you so much for coming on.